Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty interesting today. A case from India, actually.
Oh, India.
Yeah. It went all the way to their Supreme Court back in 2013. The case is called Indra Sarma v. V.K.V. Sarma. And get this, it's all about whether living together, like in a live-in relationship, can be seen as basically like being married.
That's a tricky one. Legally speaking, I mean.
Exactly. And if it is considered like marriage, would that mean those couples would have the same rights as married couples? It's a real legal puzzle.
Definitely. Sounds like a fascinating case.
It is. And we're going right to the source for this deep dive, folks. We've got an excerpt from the actual court judgment.
Wow. So we're getting the real deal. No secondhand interpretation.
Nope. Straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. So let's paint a picture here. It's 2013, and we've got Indra Sarma. She's been living with V.K.V. Sarma for, wait for it, 14 years.
14 years. That's a long time.
Right. But here's where things get complicated. He's already married, got a whole other family.
So that adds a whole other layer to this.
It does. So when the relationship ends, Indra Sarma, she wants some protection, right? And financial support, which makes sense after that long together. So she turns to the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. We'll just call it the DV Act.
Makes sense. That's there to protect women in, well, domestic situations.
Exactly. But that's where the big question pops up. Does she even qualify for protection under this act?
Because she wasn't legally married. Right. That's the crux of it, I bet.
You got it. The court had to figure out if her live-in relationship, the fact that they lived together so long, was enough to be covered by the DV Act, which, as you said, was really designed for married couples.
Right. I see where the issue lies.
Yeah, it gets into some complex territory for sure.
It does. You have to consider how marriage is viewed in India, too. It's a massive thing, both culturally and legally. It's not just, oh, hey, we're a couple. It's this huge public declaration, comes with tons of responsibilities and rights.
So live-in relationships kind of muddy the waters then.
You could say that. They're in this gray area, both socially and in the eyes of the law. So the court had a real challenge on their hands, trying to figure out if this specific live-in relationship was enough like a marriage to use the DV Act.
It sounds like they were walking a tightrope.
For sure. So where did they even begin?
Well, they had to go straight to the source, the DV Act itself.
Right. Figure out the intent, the scope.
Exactly. The Act's all about protecting women from violence. Pretty straightforward. But here's the twist. It also includes relationships that are in the nature of marriage, in what they define as domestic relationships.
In the nature of marriage, that's where things get interesting. So even if there's no official marriage certificate, you can still be protected.
That's what the court had to decide. Did this specific relationship fall under that umbrella? Was it close enough to a marriage to count?
Wow. Sounds like they had to come up with some criteria, some way to measure it.
You're telling me. They couldn't just go on a feeling, right? So they had to come up with some guidelines to figure out if a live-in relationship was truly in the nature of marriage.
So like a checklist, what kind of things were they looking for?
Oh, they got into the nitty-gritty, like how long the couple lived together, whether they shared money or property, if they split chores, how they presented themselves to others. Did they act like they were married?
Interesting. So it wasn't just about sharing an apartment. It was about how intertwined their lives were, if it mirrored a traditional marriage in practice.
Exactly. And here's the big reveal. The court actually ruled against Indra Sarma.
Really? Even after 14 years together.
It's a tough one, for sure. They acknowledged that she was in a vulnerable spot, especially financially, since she depended on him. But they said their relationship didn't actually fit the whole in the nature of marriage definition.
I'm guessing him already being married had a lot to do with that decision.
Oh, absolutely. That was a major factor. Because she knew he was already married, they said the relationship was, and get this, adulterous and bigamous.
Yeah, that complicates things. Legally speaking, I mean.
Yeah, those are some serious terms. And they used a specific word to describe her concubine.
Concubine. Hold on. Didn't those exist, like, way back in history?
It does sound like something from a history book, right?
It does. What does that even mean in a modern legal context?
It's a term that's, well, it's rooted in the past and still has some legal and social weight in India. Basically, the court was saying that even though they lived together for years, because she knew he had a wife, it changed things. their relationship couldn't be treated like a marriage under the DV Act.
Wow. So it wasn't just about the length of the relationship. It was the circumstances, the context.
Right. And that's what made this case so pivotal. It set a precedent for how these situations would be viewed legally, especially when one partner is already married.
Yeah, it's not as straightforward as just saying, hey, they lived together, so it's like they were married.
Not at all. The court drew a line in the sand, saying live-in relationships, okay, we get it. But there are rules.
And those rules are all about that in the nature of marriage idea.
Right. It's not enough to share an address. You need to be committed like in a real marriage.
So, big question then, where does this leave all those other people in live-in relationships in India? What about their rights?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. The Indra Sarma case didn't exactly shut the door on legal recognition, but it definitely laid down some ground rules.
It sparked a debate, you could say.
Exactly. It forced people to look at these relationships, how they fit into the existing legal framework, or if they even fit at all.
It challenged those assumptions, that's for sure.
It did. So what happened next? What about those new laws the court called for? Did Parliament take action? Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll unravel that part of the story.
Don't go anywhere.
All right, so we left off with the court basically saying, Parliament, you need to figure this live-in relationship thing out.
Right, they kind of tossed the ball into their court. So did anything actually happen? Did they take action?
Well, not right away, of course. Laws don't change overnight. But the Indra Sarma case, it didn't just decide what happened to that one couple.
It had ripple effects.
Big time. It really set the stage for how Indian courts view these kinds of relationships going forward, especially when you've got one partner who's already hitched.
It's like the court laid down the law, figuratively, of course, saying, look, live-in relationships are a thing, we get it, but
there are rules.
Yeah.
Exactly. And those rules, they all come back to this idea of a relationship that's in the nature of marriage.
Right. We talked about that. So it's not enough to just share a mailbox.
Nope. You need to show you're committed, really committed, like a real marriage.
Which brings us back to the big question. What happens to everyone else in India who's in a live-in relationship? What about their legal rights?
Yeah, that's the huge question that this case kind of threw out there. I mean, the Indra Sarma case, it didn't totally slam the door on the idea of legal recognition for these couples. In fact,
what?
You could argue that it actually cracked the door open even wider because it started a conversation, a big one.
By telling Parliament to get to work and make some new laws?
Next bingo. They basically said, look, this DV Act, it wasn't designed for all these messy situations. We need something new.
Okay, so Parliament's got the message. What did they do?
Well, it's complicated. There's been this growing movement in India to give live-in couples some actual legal rights, regardless of whether they're officially married or not. But it's not as simple as just saying yes or no to these relationships. The Indra Sarma case, it shows just how tricky things can get.
Well, yeah, they set those very specific criteria, right, for what actually makes a live-in relationship marriage-like. That's got to influence any new laws, right?
Absolutely. It's a whole different ballgame now. You can't just say, oh, we've lived together for X years, so we should have these rights. It goes way beyond that. It's about your finances, how you run your household, what other people think of your relationship. A ton of stuff. It's all about showing a real partnership, not just convenience.
It almost sounds like common law marriage, which they have in some countries.
Great comparison. It's not just about how long you've been together. There are other boxes you have to tick.
And proving all that, it probably gets tricky.
You bet. It can be a real headache. You might need documents, witnesses, maybe even a lawyer. Which brings us to a really important point.
Okay, lay it on me.
If anyone out there is listening and happens to be in a live-in relationship in India, the biggest takeaway from this case is don't just assume things. Don't just coast along and think, oh, I'll be fine.
Do your homework.
Exactly. Know what your rights are. Understand how the law sees these kinds of relationships. Talk to a lawyer if you need to. Figure out what you both want out of this relationship and how to protect yourselves.
Both individually and as a couple.
Exactly. And honestly, this advice isn't just for India.
Oh, you mean it applies everywhere?
Pretty much. Whether it's India or somewhere else, being open and honest with each other is crucial in any kind of relationship, but especially in a live-in situation. Be upfront about your expectations, about money, about your future plans. That can save a lot of heartache down the line. And honestly, having a written agreement about all that, not a bad idea.
Better safe than sorry, right? Especially when the law is involved.
Word. So we've talked a lot about the legal side of things, but did the Indra Sarma case actually change how people in India view live-in relationships? That's the question.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, societies don't just flip a switch and change overnight, but this case, it definitely got people talking about relationships, about rights, about how families are evolving. I mean, remember, this wasn't some quiet little courtroom drama. This thing was all over the news.
Front page news.
For sure. So it became part of a much bigger conversation about all these changing social norms.
Because, let's face it, more and more people are choosing to live together without tying the knot. For all sorts of reasons.
And the Indra Sarma case, even though it didn't explicitly say, go ahead and live together, it put a spotlight on that choice. It made people question whether the law was really doing enough to protect those who are living outside of that traditional marriage box.
It probably also gave some women the courage to seek legal help, even if they weren't, officially married.
That's a really important point. You're right. The court, by acknowledging how vulnerable women can be in these relationships, they sort of gave them permission to stand up for themselves, to fight for their rights. Even though Indra Sarma lost her particular case using the DV Act, she opened the door for others.
It's like she paved the way, even in defeat.
Exactly. To challenge the system, to demand recognition and protection.
So this wasn't just about winning or losing one case. It was about
the bigger picture. About the questions it raised.
And about making society aware of those questions.
Right. And that's often what happens with these landmark cases. They have this ripple effect. Their impact goes way beyond the individuals involved.
It's like throwing a stone in a pond. The ripples keep spreading out.
Perfect analogy. And in this case, those ripples are still spreading. As India continues to figure out how to handle all this, the legal and the social aspects of live-in relationships.
So where do we go from here? What's next for legal rights and recognition for these couples?
That's the million-dollar question. I mean, I'm not a fortune teller, but I think it's safe to say that the Indra Sarma case really did open the door to more changes. We might see new laws specifically for live-in couples, outlining their rights, their responsibilities.
Or like a roadmap for these relationships.
Right. Or maybe existing laws like the DV Act, maybe they'll be reinterpreted, expanded to offer more protection. Who knows?
Sounds like a lot of possibilities.
It is. But one thing is clear, the traditional idea of marriage, it's being challenged. And the law, well, it's slowly catching up. It's got to reflect how people are actually living their lives, Though it's got a long way to go.
So the Indra Sarma case, it answered some questions, but it also created a whole bunch more.
That's the thing about these deep dives, isn't it?
What's that?
We start off digging into one specific case, one story.
And we end up
looking at the bigger picture, realizing how much we don't know.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
Exactly. The Indra Sarma case, it's a story that's still being written. A story about legal twists and turns, about a society in flux, about people trying to figure out how they fit in.
So before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to really ponder, something to chew on. Imagine you're a lawmaker in India right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you have to create a brand new law to deal with all this rights and responsibilities for people in these live-in relationships. Where do you even start?
That's a big one, isn't it? It really makes you think about all the different angles.
It does. Yeah, like how do you balance individual rights with what society expects? It's a tough one.
It really is. And you have to consider how fast things are changing.
This whole journey for us with this case, it's been really eye-opening. We started with the specifics of Indra Sarma, V.K.V. Sarma, and now
we're talking about the future of live-in relationships in India.
And what legal recognition might look like. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. We've covered so much ground today, and honestly, it's clear that there's no easy answer.
There's no magic solution.
Right. There are debates going on, legal battles being fought, social norms are shifting. I mean, this is a conversation that's going to keep going for a long time.
Which is why we love these deep dives.
Yeah.
We get to explore a topic from all sides. We uncover the complexity and often end up with
more questions than answers.
Exactly. But those questions, they're important.
They're so important.
They keep us curious. They keep us learning. And they encourage us to really think about these issues.
And to talk about them, have those conversations with each other.
All right. So to everyone listening, we encourage you keep digging into this topic.
Read more about the case. Look at the legal arguments. Think about how it affects society.
What do you think should happen next? What's the best way forward?
And talk about it with others. Share your thoughts and get those conversations going, because it's through those conversations, through critical thinking, that we can really make a difference.
And that's what it's all about, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of live-in relationships and legal rights in India. It's been a journey.
It has.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.